They laughed at her idea for less than 30 seconds. 3 weeks later, those same executives were standing in front of investors presenting her strategy as if they had built it themselves. And the most terrifying part for them wasn't that Claire Bennett knew the truth. It was that she had known this would happen from the very beginning. The 42nd floor of Vailcrest Dynamics overlooked downtown Chicago like a kingdom built from glass and ambition. Floor-to-ceiling windows reflected the cold blue light of a rainy Thursday morning while executives in tailored suits filtered into the boardroom carrying espresso cups and polished confidence. The long black conference table gleamed beneath recessed lighting, spotless and intimidating, designed less for collaboration and more for hierarchy. At the far end of the room sat Ethan Caldwell, Senior Vice President of Strategic Growth, a man whose silver cufflinks and practiced smile had survived 15 years of corporate politics without a single visible scratch. Beside him, directors scrolled through tablets and checked market reports with the kind of detached urgency that only existed in billion-dollar companies. Then there was Claire Bennett. She sat quietly near the middle of the table wearing a soft gray cardigan over a navy blouse, her brown leather notebook resting beside a closed laptop covered in faded coffee shop stickers. Most people walking into the room wouldn't have guessed she was the lead consumer behavior analyst responsible for predicting 2 of the company's most profitable product launches. In truth, many executives barely remembered her name at all. To them, Claire was simply the quiet woman who took notes during meetings and asked uncomfortable questions no one wanted to answer. Outside the room, assistants hurried through marble hallways while muted thunder rolled across the skyline. Inside, Ethan tapped the table lightly. "Let's move," he said. "We're already behind schedule." Slides flickered onto the massive presentation screen as department heads gave rapid-fire updates on customer retention, engagement metrics, and falling subscription renewals. Numbers climbed. Numbers dropped. Executives spoke in rehearsed corporate language polished smooth from years of repetition. Claire listened silently, her steady eyes moving between charts and faces. Then came the final agenda item. Ethan leaned back in his chair and adjusted his watch. Claire had some alternative strategy proposal she wanted to share, he said casually, though the amusement in his voice drew a few smirks around the table. "Apparently, we're reinventing customer trust today." Quiet laughter drifted through the room. Claire opened her laptop slowly. "I believe our current campaign is creating short-term growth at the cost of long-term customer confidence," she said calmly. "I think if we continue pushing aggressive conversion tactics, we'll damage brand loyalty within 6 months." The room became still for half a second before one executive chuckled openly. Another exchanged glances with a colleague. Ethan folded his hands together. "And your solution?" Claire clicked to her first slide. "Simple design. Clean data. No flashy animations. We shift toward transparency-based retention," she explained. "Less pressure selling. More customer ownership. If clients feel respected instead of manipulated, retention stabilizes naturally." Ethan stared at the screen for a moment before smiling thinly. "That might sound inspiring in a college ethics seminar," he said, "but this is a competitive market, Claire. We need killers in this room, not philosophers." The laughter hit harder this time. Someone muttered, "Customer feeling strategy," under their breath. Claire's fingers rested lightly on the edge of her laptop. She didn't argue. Didn't defend herself, didn't shrink either. She simply looked around the room as the executives laughed beneath the skyline reflections, memorizing every face. And somewhere behind her calm expression, something colder than embarrassment quietly settled into place. The meeting ended the same way most executive meetings at Vailcrest Dynamics ended, with expensive shoes gliding across polished floors while people congratulated themselves for sounding decisive. Chairs rolled back. Tablets disappeared into leather briefcases. The skyline beyond the windows had darkened into sheets of rain, turning the city below into a blur of headlights and reflections. Claire remained seated for a few extra seconds after everyone else stood up. Her presentation still glowed faintly on the massive screen behind her, untouched and dismissed in less than 4 minutes. Ethan stopped beside her chair while buttoning his suit jacket. "Do not take it personally," he said with a polished smile that somehow felt colder than open hostility. "You are intelligent, Claire, but business rewards confidence, not caution." He tapped the edge of her notebook lightly before walking away. "You should think bigger." Claire watched him leave without answering. The boardroom doors closed behind the executives with a soft mechanical hush. Silence settled over the room like dust after a performance. She slowly closed her laptop and slid the worn leather notebook into her bag. On the final page of her notes, she wrote only 3 words. They will panic. Downstairs, the main lobby buzzed with the restless energy of a company obsessed with speed. Giant digital screens promoted the upcoming launch campaign, while employees hurried between elevators balancing coffee cups and impossible deadlines. Claire moved quietly through the chaos unnoticed, just another figure in neutral colors carrying too much work. Near the reception desk, 2 junior analysts whispered while watching her pass. That was brutal, one murmured. Why would she even challenge Ethan in front of everybody? The other shrugged. Because she thinks customers care about trust. They laughed softly before disappearing into an elevator. Claire heard every word. Her expression never changed. Outside, cold rain tapped against the glass entrance as she crossed the street toward a small corner cafe wedged between a pharmacy and an old bookstore. Unlike the towering marble and chrome of Valecrest, the cafe smelled like cinnamon, espresso, and worn paperbacks. Claire sat near the window beneath warm amber lights and opened her laptop again. Spreadsheets filled the screen. Customer behavior reports, complaint trends, subscription cancellation patterns. Hundreds of pages executives never fully read because the numbers were inconvenient. She studied them the way some people studied storms before landfall. The same pattern appeared everywhere. Customers were staying shorter. Complaints about manipulative renewal tactics had doubled in 6 months. Trust scores were collapsing beneath temporary profit spikes. Claire highlighted another section quietly. She had seen this before years ago at another company that ignored consumer resentment until the backlash destroyed their brand reputation almost overnight. Most people in the corporate world only listened to data when it screamed. Claire listened while it whispered. Hours passed. Rain streaked the windows in silver lines while evening traffic crawled through downtown Chicago. Around 7:30, her phone buzzed with an internal company email. Subject line, Q4 Customer Expansion Initiative. Ethan Caldwell had already announced the official rollout of the exact aggressive strategy she warned against that morning. Mandatory upselling, forced subscription bundling, automated retention traps. Claire read the message once before leaning back slowly in her chair. Around her, dishes clinked softly, and jazz music drifted through hidden speakers. She looked out the cafe window toward the distant glow of Valecrest Tower, standing against the dark clouds like a monument to arrogance. Then she reopened her notebook and began writing again. Not complaints, not arguments. Contingency projections, revenue fallout estimates, recovery models. Quietly and methodically, Claire Bennett prepared for a disaster no one else in that glass tower believed was coming. And somewhere deep inside the company, beneath all the confidence and polished presentations, the first invisible cracks had already begun to spread. 3 weeks later, the atmosphere inside Valecrest Dynamics had changed in ways no executive wanted to admit out loud. The confidence that once floated effortlessly through the glass hallways now felt forced, stretched thin beneath mounting pressure and whispered panic. Screens across the marketing department displayed falling retention numbers in angry shades of red, while customer complaints flooded support channels faster than teams could contain them. Social media backlash spread like wildfire through finance blogs and consumer forums, accusing the company of manipulative subscription practices and deceptive renewal tactics. The same campaign Ethan Caldwell had celebrated as aggressive innovation was now being called predatory by national business reporters. And every hour the damage grew worse. On the 42nd floor, executives gathered around the conference table again, but this time nobody laughed. Coffee cups sat untouched. Ties loosened. Faces looked pale beneath the sterile overhead lighting. Rain hammered against the windows while city traffic crawled far below like streams of red and white lights trapped beneath the storm. Ethan stood at the front of the room staring at the latest financial projections projected across the massive screen. Customer cancellations increased another 18% overnight, one director said carefully. We are also losing enterprise accounts. Another executive shifted uneasily. 3 major investors requested emergency calls this morning. Ethan rubbed his jaw tightly. Public attention dies quickly, he replied. though even he sounded unconvinced. We pushed through the cycle. But the room no longer moved with his confidence. Fear had begun replacing certainty, and fear changed people. Near the end of the table, a young analyst named Tyler Reynolds quietly scrolled through archived internal proposals while executives argued over public relations strategies. Tyler had only worked at Vailcrest for 8 months, long enough to understand one thing clearly. The loudest people in the company were rarely the smartest. As voices rose around him, he paused suddenly. A familiar document title appeared on his screen. Customer Trust Recovery Framework. Submitted by Claire Bennett 3 weeks earlier. Tyler frowned and opened the file. The room continued arguing behind him while he read in silence. His expression slowly changed. Claire had predicted everything. Declining retention, consumer backlash, investor instability, media criticism, even the exact timing of the collapse. More disturbing than the accuracy of her warnings was the solution itself. Calm, detailed, elegant. A full recovery strategy built around transparency, customer respect, and long-term trust rebuilding. Tyler looked up from the screen toward the executives still scrambling for answers that already existed inside Claire's ignored proposal. You guys should probably see this, he said quietly. Nobody responded at first. Ethan continued speaking over him. We tighten messaging and accelerate conversion before fourth quarter reporting. Tyler swallowed hard. Sir. This time the room paused. Ethan turned with visible irritation. What? Tyler rotated his laptop slowly across the table. Claire Bennett already mapped this out weeks ago. Silence settled over the boardroom. One executive leaned forward. Another adjusted his glasses and began reading faster. The confidence drained from Ethan's face line by line. Every projection matched their current crisis with terrifying precision. One section even contained a sentence highlighted in yellow. If aggressive retention pressure continues past October, public trust erosion will become financially irreversible within one fiscal cycle. The room went completely still. Outside the windows, thunder rolled across the Chicago skyline, while reflections from the city lights flickered across frozen faces. Ethan stared at Claire's proposal without blinking. For the first time in years, the man who controlled every room he entered suddenly looked unsure of himself. And somewhere downstairs in a quiet corner office surrounded by handwritten notes and cold coffee cups, Claire Bennett continued working peacefully, completely unaware that the people who mocked her ideas were now desperately searching for a way to survive, without admitting she had been right all along. The emergency strategy meeting lasted nearly 4 hours, but by the end of it, only one thing had become painfully clear. Vailcrest Dynamics no longer had a solution of its own. The company that prided itself on innovation was now staring at survival instructions written by the very woman they had publicly humiliated less than a month earlier. The realization sat heavily over the boardroom like smoke nobody wanted to acknowledge. Ethan Caldwell remained standing near the windows long after most executives returned to their seats. Chicago's skyline shimmered beneath storm clouds while reflections from the conference screen flickered across his tense expression. On the table behind him, printed copies of Claire Bennett's proposal lay scattered between untouched coffees and half-open financial reports. How many people have seen this document? Ethan finally asked without turning around. Tyler hesitated. Just this room, I think. Ethan nodded once. Good. That single word changed the atmosphere instantly. Executives exchanged uneasy glances. They understood exactly what he meant. This was no longer about solving the crisis. It was about controlling the narrative before anyone discovered who had actually predicted the collapse. One executive cleared her throat carefully. Her recovery framework could stabilize retention within 2 quarters if implemented correctly. Another leaned forward. The investor board is demanding answers by Monday. We do not have time to rebuild strategy from scratch. Ethan slowly turned back toward the table. The polished confidence from weeks earlier had faded into something sharper and colder. Then we adapt the framework, he said. Quietly. Silence followed. Even the rain against the windows seemed louder now. Tyler looked down at the printed proposal in front of him, suddenly uncomfortable. Should we bring Claire into the meetings? He asked cautiously. Ethan's eyes narrowed almost invisibly. Claire works in analytics, he replied smoothly. This level of implementation requires executive leadership. The room understood the message immediately. Claire's ideas were valuable. Claire herself was not. And in companies built on ego, powerful people often found it easier to steal brilliance than admit they had overlooked it. By Friday morning, the transformation had already begun. Departments received revised rollout plans filled with language lifted almost word for word from Claire's original proposal. Transparency-based retention, consumer trust rebuilding, long-term loyalty architecture. Executives repeated the phrases confidently during meetings as though they had personally crafted every line. Entire slide decks were redesigned overnight using her framework. Even the color palette mirrored the presentation they once mocked. But the deeper they copied, the more nervous they became. Because buried inside every chart and projection was proof that Claire Bennett had seen the disaster before any of them. Around noon, Claire entered the 36th floor operations center carrying her usual black coffee and notebook. The room felt strangely different. Conversations stopped when she walked by. People glanced away too quickly. One junior employee awkwardly minimized a presentation slide the moment she approached. Claire slowed slightly. Her calm eyes moved across the room. Large screens displayed updated recovery, messaging remarkably familiar to her own work. She recognized entire sentences. Exact phrasing, exact sequencing. Even her recommendation hierarchy remained untouched. She stood there quietly for a moment while keyboards clicked nervously around her. Nobody met her eyes. Then she continued walking without saying a word. Upstairs, Ethan reviewed the revised investor presentation with the senior executive team. "This is strong," one director admitted while flipping through the slides. "Honestly, it is the first thing that has made sense in weeks." Ethan adjusted his tie slowly. "Because now we are finally speaking the language customers respond to." But even as he spoke, there was tension beneath his voice. Because somewhere deep down, he knew the truth no amount of polished delivery could erase. None of this belonged to him. And the most dangerous person in the building was no longer the angry investors, the collapsing stock price, or the growing media backlash. It was the quiet woman in the gray cardigan who had seen everything coming before any of them even realized they were in danger. Monday arrived beneath a cold gray sky that seemed to press down over downtown Chicago like a warning. By 7 in the morning, the executive floors of Vailcrest Dynamics were already alive with nervous movement. Assistants rushed between offices carrying revised reports while financial analysts updated projections every 20 minutes as if changing numbers fast enough could somehow stop reality from unfolding. The investor meeting scheduled for 10 o'clock had become the only thing anyone talked about. Because if the board lost confidence today, the company's stock would not survive the quarter intact. Upstairs in the executive conference suite, Ethan Caldwell adjusted the cuffs of his navy suit while rehearsing talking points beneath his breath. Behind him, a giant presentation screen displayed the new recovery strategy in crisp white lettering against a dark blue background. Customer Trust Recovery Initiative. The title alone made Ethan uneasy. It sounded too measured, too honest, too much like Claire Bennett. Still, he continued reviewing the slides with controlled confidence. He had spent his entire career mastering perception. And perception, in rooms like these, often mattered more than truth. Around the table, executives practiced transitions and responses for difficult investor questions. "We frame this as proactive adaptation," one director said, "not crisis management." Another nodded quickly. "We emphasize customer loyalty restructuring." No one acknowledged that every sentence coming out of their mouths belonged originally to a woman they had laughed at publicly less than a month ago. Downstairs on the 36th floor, Claire sat quietly at her desk reviewing retention data with headphones resting loosely around her neck. Morning sunlight filtered weakly through the office windows while keyboards clicked steadily around her. She noticed the tension in the building immediately. Executives moving faster. Security guards stationed near conference entrances. Assistants whispering in corners. Something important was happening upstairs. But nobody had invited her. Around 9:15, Tyler Reynolds appeared beside her cubicle holding a tablet against his chest. He looked uncomfortable. "Claire," he said carefully, "did you know they are using your framework for the investor meeting?" Claire lifted her eyes calmly from the screen. "I assumed they would," she replied. Tyler blinked in surprise. "You are not upset?" For the first time all morning, Claire allowed herself the smallest smile. People reveal themselves when pressure removes the performance. she said quietly. Tyler stood there speechless for a moment. Then his expression shifted toward guilt. They copied almost everything. Claire closed her notebook gently. Did they also copy the understanding behind it? Tyler frowned slightly. What do you mean? Claire looked toward the elevators leading to the executive floors. A strategy only works if the people presenting it actually believe in it. Upstairs, investors began arriving one by one beneath the glow of crystal lighting and polished marble floors. Men and women worth billions shook hands politely while assistants distributed leather folders embossed with the company logo. The atmosphere felt elegant on the surface, but beneath the polished greetings lingered tension sharp enough to cut through the room. Ethan stepped onto the presentation stage precisely at 10 o'clock. Thank you all for being here, he began smoothly. The massive screen illuminated behind him while executives sat in a perfect line nearby. Ethan moved confidently through the opening slides, explaining the company's new direction with the practiced authority of someone accustomed to controlling every room he entered. Customer trust, transparency, long-term loyalty. The words sounded impressive beneath the warm lighting and skyline views. Several investors nodded thoughtfully. For a moment, it almost worked. Then an older investor near the front slowly raised his hand. His silver hair reflected the screen light as he adjusted his glasses. Interesting framework, he said calmly. I believe I have seen parts of this before. Ethan's smile tightened almost invisibly. We have been developing this internally for several weeks. The investor studied him for a long moment before responding. That is strange, he said quietly, because I distinctly remember receiving an almost identical proposal directly from Claire Bennett nearly a month ago. The room went silent. The silence inside the executive conference suite felt heavier than the storm clouds hanging over Chicago. For several long seconds, nobody moved. The investor's words lingered in the air like something irreversible. Ethan Caldwell remained frozen beside the glowing presentation screen while dozens of eyes slowly shifted toward him, waiting for an explanation that did not exist. The older investor sat calmly near the front row, his expression unreadable beneath the soft lighting. Claire Bennett sent me this framework after a consumer behavior summit in September, he continued evenly. At the time, I thought it was one of the clearest long-term retention strategies I had read in years. Several executives visibly stiffened. One director quietly lowered her eyes to the printed presentation folder in front of her. Another reached for his water glass with slightly trembling fingers. Ethan forced a controlled smile onto his face, though the confidence behind it had begun cracking apart. Claire contributed research support to several internal discussions, he replied carefully. This initiative was ultimately developed through executive collaboration. The investor held his gaze for a moment too long. Interesting, he said softly. Because the proposal I received included her personal notes, predictive models, and time-stamped revisions dating back nearly a month before this crisis began. The room went completely still again. Not polite silence. Not professional silence. The kind of silence that arrives when everyone suddenly understands exactly what happened, but nobody wants to be the first person to say it aloud. Near the back of the room, another investor slowly closed the presentation folder. So the analyst everyone ignored predicted the collapse before leadership did? She asked bluntly. No one answered. Ethan glanced toward the executive table, silently searching for support. None came, because every person sitting there remembered the meeting. The laughter, the mockery, the dismissive smiles when Claire Bennett warned them exactly where this path would lead. And now those same people sat beneath crystal lights presenting her ideas while investors quietly pieced together the truth on their own. Downstairs on the 36th floor, Claire remained at her desk reviewing retention updates, completely unaware that the executive floor above her was beginning to unravel. Her headphones rested around her neck while soft instrumental music played quietly from her laptop speakers. Outside the office windows, rain streaked the skyline in silver ribbons. Then her phone buzzed. Internal message from Tyler Reynolds. You should come upstairs. Claire stared at the message for a moment before setting her pen down slowly. Upstairs, pressure spread through the conference suite like invisible electricity. Investors began exchanging quiet remarks among themselves while Ethan attempted to regain control of the meeting. The important thing now is execution, he said firmly. Our leadership team is fully committed to restoring customer confidence. But the words sounded hollow now. Because trust, once damaged, rarely breaks in one dramatic moment. It erodes slowly through arrogance, ego, and the belief that intelligence only belongs to the loudest person in the room. Then the conference doors opened quietly. Claire Bennett stepped inside wearing the same gray cardigan she always wore, her leather notebook resting against her side. Several executives visibly straightened in their chairs. Others suddenly became fascinated with their laptops. Ethan's expression tightened almost imperceptibly the moment he saw her. The older investor near the front immediately stood up with genuine warmth crossing his face. "Ms. Bennett," he said, "good to finally meet you in person." Claire paused slightly, confused by the sudden attention surrounding her. The investor lifted the presentation folder gently. "I have been trying to convince companies for years to think long-term about customer trust," he said. "You are the first person I have seen explain it in a way that actually works." No one in the room spoke. Ethan stood motionless near the screen while the weight of the moment settled over the executives like concrete. Because in a single instant, the invisible woman they dismissed had become the only person investors truly respected. And the people who once laughed at her ideas now sat in absolute silence, watching someone else finally recognize the brilliance they were too arrogant to value when it mattered most. For the rest of the meeting, the balance of power inside the conference suite shifted so dramatically that even the air in the room felt different. Executives who once spoke over Claire Bennett now carefully waited for her responses before continuing discussions. Investors directed questions toward her instead of Ethan Caldwell, and every answer she gave came calmly, clearly, without even the slightest trace of arrogance. That was the part many people found hardest to understand. Claire had every reason to humiliate the people who mocked her. Instead, she remained composed, measured, professional. The older investor, whose name was Leonard Mercer, adjusted his glasses while reviewing her original proposal again. "Your predictive timeline was remarkably accurate," he said. "Most firms react to customer distrust after the damage spreads. You anticipated it before the backlash even peaked." Claire nodded slightly. "People tolerate inconvenience," she replied softly. "They do not tolerate feeling manipulated for very long." Several investors exchanged thoughtful glances. Ethan stood near the presentation screen with his jaw tightened so subtly that most people would have missed it. Every sentence Claire spoke strengthened her credibility while quietly exposing how badly leadership had failed. One executive attempted to redirect the discussion. Fortunately, our executive team recognized the value of the framework quickly enough to adapt. The room felt awkwardly quiet after the statement. Nobody corrected him. Nobody supported him either, because the truth had already settled into the room too heavily to ignore. Leonard Mercer slowly closed the proposal folder and looked directly at Ethan. "Did your team recognize the value quickly?" he asked calmly. "Or only after the numbers forced you to?" Ethan opened his mouth slightly, but no answer came immediately. That hesitation said more than any explanation could have. The room went silent again. Outside the towering windows, clouds drifted across the skyline, while pale afternoon light reflected against the polished conference table. Claire noticed several executives avoiding eye contact altogether now. Others looked genuinely uncomfortable. For the first time since she entered the room. In corporate environments, power often depended on perception, and perception had just changed permanently. Leonard turned back toward Claire. "How involved were you in designing the recovery implementation?" Before Claire could answer, Ethan stepped forward smoothly. "Claire contributed analytical support during development," he said carefully. "Leadership handled the strategic execution process. It was a subtle attempt to reclaim authority, a final effort to minimize her role without openly denying it. But this time, something unexpected happened. Tyler Reynolds, seated quietly near the back of the room, spoke up. "That is not true." Every head turned instantly. Tyler swallowed hard beneath the sudden pressure, but continued anyway. "The framework, customer recovery sequencing, communication model, retention projections, and implementation phases were all hers. I saw the original files." Ethan stared at him in disbelief. "Tyler," he warned quietly. But Tyler kept going. "The executives rejected her proposal during the strategy meeting 3 weeks ago," he said. "After the backlash started, they rebuilt the investor presentation using her framework almost word for word." Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted him. The silence that followed felt almost physical. Ethan's face lost color beneath the conference lighting, while several executives shifted uncomfortably in their seats. One woman near the end of the table slowly removed her glasses and looked down, unable to meet Claire's eyes anymore. Because the room no longer saw her as invisible. They saw her exactly as she had always been. Intelligent, observant, necessary. Leonard Mercer leaned back thoughtfully before speaking again. That explains why this presentation suddenly developed clarity after weeks of disastrous public messaging. A few investors nodded subtly. Ethan looked trapped now, standing beneath giant screens filled with ideas that no longer belonged to him in the eyes of anyone present. Claire remained still throughout all of it. No anger crossed her expression. No triumph either. Only quiet understanding. Because people who spend years being underestimated learn something important over time. The loudest victory is rarely the most powerful one. Sometimes the strongest moment arrives when the truth no longer needs defending because everyone in the room can already see it for themselves. After Tyler Reynolds spoke, the atmosphere inside the conference suite changed completely. The polished corporate performance that had defined the meeting from the beginning finally collapsed beneath the weight of undeniable truth. Nobody looked at the giant presentation screen anymore. Nobody cared about the carefully rehearsed talking points or polished executive language. Every eye in the room had shifted toward Claire Bennett, the quiet analyst executives once treated like background noise. Ethan Caldwell stood motionless beside the glowing screen while the silence around him deepened into something almost humiliating. In rooms built on status, silence could become louder than shouting. Leonard Mercer slowly removed his glasses and folded them carefully in front of him. "Mr. Caldwell," he said calmly, "I have spent 40 years investing in companies. Do you know the fastest way leadership loses credibility?" Ethan forced himself to answer. "Poor performance?" Leonard shook his head once. "No. It is when executives mistake intelligence for hierarchy." The words landed hard across the room. Several investors lowered their eyes, while others watched Ethan carefully, waiting to see whether he would finally admit the truth. Outside the windows, the storm clouds had begun breaking apart, thin beams of afternoon sunlight cutting across the skyline and reflecting against the polished marble floors. Ethan adjusted his tie slowly, buying time. "Mistakes were made during internal evaluation," he said carefully. "But our priority now is moving forward together." Claire listened quietly from near the conference doors, her notebook resting calmly against her side. She noticed something important in Ethan's response. Even now, standing in front of investors who clearly understood what happened, he still could not say the words directly. He still could not publicly acknowledge her contribution without wrapping it in corporate language designed to protect himself. Some people would rather lose respect than surrender pride. Leonard turned toward Claire again. "Ms. Bennett," he said, "if you had been allowed to implement your strategy from the beginning, would this company have avoided the crisis?" The room became perfectly still. Ethan's jaw tightened immediately. Several executives looked nervous before Claire even answered. Because everyone already knew the truth. Claire considered the question carefully. Then she spoke in the same calm voice she had used from the very beginning. "The backlash could have been reduced significantly," she said. "Customers usually forgive mistakes when they feel respected early enough. No bitterness. No arrogance. Just honesty." That answer affected the room more than anger ever could have. One investor quietly leaned toward another and whispered something while nodding toward Claire. Nearby executives noticed it too. And for the first time that afternoon, genuine fear crossed Ethan Caldwell's face. Because he finally understood the real danger. Investors were no longer looking at him as the future of the company. They were looking at her. Leonard Mercer stood slowly from his chair and buttoned his dark suit jacket. "I would like to make something very clear," he announced to the room. "I am willing to continue supporting Veilcrest Dynamics financially under one condition." Every executive straightened immediately. "Future strategic recovery efforts," Leonard continued, "must be led directly by the person who demonstrated actual foresight, not by the people who ignored it." Absolute silence followed. Ethan looked stunned. Several executives exchanged alarmed glances while tension spread visibly through the room. Then Leonard turned toward Claire with a respectful nod. "Ms. Bennett," he said calmly, "I believe this company needs your leadership far more than it needs polished presentations." Claire blinked slightly, genuinely caught off guard by the statement. Around her, executives who once dismissed her ideas now sat frozen beneath the conference lighting, unable to hide the realization slowly settling across their faces. The invisible woman, they laughed at, had become the one person powerful investors trusted most. And in that moment, every expensive suit, every executive title, and every arrogant comment from weeks earlier suddenly felt very small compared to the quiet intelligence standing calmly near the door in a gray cardigan, holding a worn leather notebook. No one spoke for several seconds after Leonard Mercer finished talking. The silence inside the conference suite no longer felt tense. It felt final, like the moment a performance ends and the audience finally sees what was hidden behind the stage lights the entire time. Ethan Caldwell stood beneath the giant presentation screen surrounded by polished slides, executive titles, and years of carefully maintained authority, yet somehow he had never looked smaller. Claire Bennett remained near the conference doors holding her notebook quietly against her side, while afternoon sunlight spilled through the windows behind her, casting long reflections across the marble floor. For years she had walked through this building unnoticed. Now every person in the room seemed unable to look anywhere else. Leonard Mercer adjusted his jacket and turned toward the investor table. "I believe leadership is revealed most clearly during moments of pressure," he said calmly. "Some people protect their image. Others protect the future." Nobody disagreed. Several investors nodded subtly, while executives sat motionless in uncomfortable silence. Ethan finally stepped away from the presentation screen, his polished confidence visibly worn down by the truth he could no longer control. He looked toward Claire for the first time that day, without arrogance in his expression, only exhaustion. "Claire," he said carefully, "perhaps we handled your proposal too quickly." The understatement hung awkwardly in the room. Claire studied him quietly for a moment. She remembered the laughter, the dismissive smiles, the way her ideas had been treated like entertainment instead of warning. But she also understood something many people in powerful rooms never learned. Humiliation changes some people into revenge seekers. Others become impossible to intimidate. Claire had become the second kind. She walked slowly toward the conference table while executives watched nervously. Then she placed her worn leather notebook beside the polished investor folders. The contrast alone seemed to say everything. "I did not build the framework to prove anyone wrong," she said softly. "I built it because customers eventually recognize when a company stops respecting them." The room remained perfectly still. Claire's voice never rose. She did not attack anyone. She did not embarrass Ethan publicly, even though she easily could have. That restraint affected the room more deeply than anger ever would have. Leonard Mercer smiled faintly. "That," he said quietly, "is the kind of thinking companies survive on." Ethan lowered his eyes briefly. Somewhere deep down, he understood the lesson now. Intelligence had been sitting in the room with him the entire time. He simply could not recognize it because it arrived without arrogance. Claire reached into her bag and removed a single envelope. She slid it gently across the conference table toward Ethan. Several executives exchanged alarmed looks immediately. Ethan stared down at the envelope before slowly opening it. Inside was a resignation letter. The room went silent again. "You are leaving?" one executive asked in disbelief. Claire nodded once. "I spent years trying to help this company listen before problems became crises," she replied calmly. "But people only hear wisdom when they are finally forced to." Ethan looked genuinely stunned now. "Claire, after everything today, we can fix this," he said quickly. "We can discuss a promotion, leadership restructuring, whatever you want." Claire gave the smallest shake of her head. "Respect offered only after public embarrassment is not respect," she said. "It is damage control." No one had an answer for that. Outside the windows, the storm had finally passed. Sunlight spread across downtown Chicago while the city below slowly returned to motion. Claire picked up her notebook and turned toward the doors. Then Leonard Mercer stood once more. "Ms. Bennett," he called after her. Claire paused. Leonard smiled warmly. "If you ever decide to build something of your own, you will not need to look very hard for investors." For the first time all day, genuine emotion crossed Claire's face. Not triumph, not revenge, just quiet appreciation. She thanked him softly before walking out of the conference suite beneath the stunned gaze of executives who once laughed at her ideas. The doors closed gently behind her. And inside that silent room filled with expensive suits and polished egos, everyone finally understood the truth they should have recognized from the beginning. The most dangerous person to underestimate is often the quiet one who never needed the room's approval in the first place.